Terrific. Thank you, folks, and thanks for joining us today. Way that we're going to handle questions is that I will stop a couple of times during the program and see what kind of questions come in. And if you have questions that we don't have time for or are one of those what I call why is blue or really isn't about the topic today, feel free to contact me privately, and we don't charge for email or phone consultation on that. And the topic today, again, is how to manage your local node in a global workplace. And being sponsored by the wonderful people here at DoSpace, and I love to read their mission. I love this. A community technology library dedicated to empowering our community through access to technology and innovative learning experiences. So for those of you who don't know me, I've been a trainer and consultant since 1978. Right now, most of my clients are libraries, universities, local government, nonprofits and small businesses, but I've worked with a lot of different groups. And one of the way I got into all of this is in 1975, my husband started something called the Office for Open Network, which turned into an international information service. And we had clients in 38 states and 8 countries, but this was before cell phones, before the internet. And we had to communicate with them literally by phone. And later we had that really high-tech thing you might have heard of called a fax machine, and by regular mail. And then obviously technology advanced and we had to do more. And over the last 20 years as a trainer and consultant where I was really traveling a lot, have clients in every state in the United States and in about 14 countries. And my husband and I myself manage client contracts all over. And so for us, the quarantine was sort of like business as usual. I'm not traveling, but being at home, running a business out of our home for people all over the country is something that we're kind of used to. So what I'm going to be sharing today is kind of how we do things and how we help other people do things as well. And I want to start on a quick story before we go too much further about an experience that I just finished. I was contracted 1.5 years ago with a national association. Now, this was a group I had worked with for 20 years, knew the people, knew the players, had seen them face to face at national conferences. You know, we kind of knew each other. Then there was a big regime change, and the new head of the project I was working with is a super good guy named Tom. And I have to emphasize, everybody involved in this project, super good, super smart, experienced with online communication. All right, so there weren't any real newbies. But the first few months of failures were breathtaking. For example, Tom, who's great, had never worked with any of the technology before, and he was supposed to be the person running everything. Another woman, another person, Mary, who was the one who started the whole program, who was supposed to be my main contact and was supposed to be part of our team of subject matter experts, did a really, I hate to say, not very smart thing. She ran for office in this association and got elected president. And she didn't expect that, right? She even called me and apologized. And if you've ever been president of a national professional association, you spend the next year traveling. So I think of all the weekly and bi-weekly meetings that we had over that 1.5 years, I think she was able to attend 6 of them. So I lost a big chunk of my support network. The technical people who were doing the instructional design on this big project were 2 terrific people, smart and accommodating, one in Florida, one in California. So me and Tom and the 2 technical people had never met in person. We had never worked together, and we were all working on brand new technology. And I would say, and again, I was the lowest person on the totem pole. I had input in terms of content, but in terms of managing the project, whatever, I had really no say. And finally, as I built credibility with the group, I made some suggestions. The technical people did, Tom did. And after about 6 months, we were working together pretty smoothly. We met all our deadlines. The products that we came out with are really good. I'm proud of what we did. But you know, if we had followed some of this advice in the beginning, I think it would have been better. So the key idea today, one of the key ideas that we have this fantasy that technology is supposed to be somehow more efficient and effective. And the truth is that particularly if you're out of sight, out of mind, it takes more time. It takes more what we call management overhead to keep in touch with the other people on the team, even though you think it's just about sending off a bunch of emails or texts or being in a video conference. And I think it's one of the reasons that people I know who are using tools like Zoom, like we're on today, but with all the videos and everything, people are exhausted because consciously or unconsciously, it's taking more time. The other thing which I think is really important, that out of sight, out of mind does not mean that that person isn't a person. And I've noticed for some of the clients I have, they become, let's just say, abrupt. They become a little rude, a little short tempered in their exchanges with other people. And we just finished a webinar for another client in Maryland, and it was an international webinar, and we had 2,400 people register and 1,000 show up. And after the webinar finished, I probably received about 140 emails from people who had attended, who had questions or technical problems, whatever. And I noticed they fell into two groups. One was the group that spent that extra little time to put in, hi, how are you, a thank you. And the other group were the people who just sort of grunted at me, right? To the point that sometimes I had to go back and ask them to explain what their text or their email was about, because they had typed it out so fast and had missed a few consonants, right? And I just didn't know, it's like, give me a vowel. I don't know what you're saying. But the people who were connecting with me as a person, who said thank you even, those were the people who I found myself wanting to answer their emails first. The people who just sort of grunted at me about whatever was going, I didn't feel predisposed to answer them right away. Now, I'm a good person, so I just sort of, tried to take them as they were coming in. But if it was at all complicated or all required me looking at other files or something like that, I noticed that people who remembered that there was a person at the other end of that wet string and tin can, I was predisposed to want to be better for them. And I was sort of embarrassed for myself, like, come on, Pat, you shouldn't do that. But yes, I did. So what's the agenda today? I love the phrase Worknet. It's old jargon, but I kind of like it. So one of the most important things we have to figure out is who makes decisions. And by the way, that was something that took us about 2 months on this little team of people, of who actually made decisions about what and when in the process we were using. That whole thing of how to establish rapport and goodwill with people, and the fact that I don't care who you are, I don't care how old you are, I don't care what mythical, sociological, made-up generation you're from, or so on our planet, across cultures, guess what? Manners work. Manners work. And manners are rituals of respect for the other person. And some anthropologists even believe that we're hardwired to respond to manners. Some people the neuroscience folks, who poke around in people's brains and look at how we relate to each other, say, you know what? Manners works with most people most of the time. Now, I do a job in life. I'm good at what I do. I'm not perfect. I don't know if I'd get an A plus, but I'm good. I give myself a solid B minus most days. But I'm always amazed how many people say, we like to work with you because you're nice, you're polite, you're mannerly. It matters to people, and it's something about that extra effort that we have to make online. Now, we're working with people who, if you're working online with a team, and it may be that you had a job that you went to and now you're at home and you may be dealing with those same people. Nonetheless, it's amazing what happens in a physical building when suddenly the building has an extra floor, or your workplace has grown enough that you are all in one office, now you're in multiple offices or actually in multiple buildings, how it changes that relationship. It's like a piece of rubber band that stretches and gets thinner and thinner. So we can't assume we know what the expectations are of other people. Um, Spend a lot of time listening to people the last 2 months talking about the problems they're having accessing information, technological information. And for a lot of the people, particularly from small towns, and in the case of Nebraska, outside that eastern Nebraska part, and I have toured the entire state plus the adjoining states and know it very well. Uh, not not everybody lives in Omaha. Not everybody lives in a place with established multinational corporations with bells and whistles. And so sometimes it's like people are sent home, and what I'm discovering is that even people, middle class folks who have decent jobs, guess what? They're part of that digital divide. They have less. So what are the expectations? And then one of the things I warn people, and I've lived through this many times, is you've got a technical deadline. You have, for example, a really important conference that you have to be there. Maybe part of your work is you have to do a presentation to people higher than you are in the food chain to talk about something you're doing. Well, you figure out what's going on before there's a problem. Before there's a problem. One of the reasons that I always check in early on a webinar, even if I have problems, and I warn my clients, I don't do back-to-back webinars. I don't do back-to-back online meetings. I need a chance to take a drink of water, go check on things here at the house, make sure that my husband hasn't gotten into trouble in the last 30 minutes that I've seen him, stand up, take a look around, and then have a chance to make sure that the technology is working. So we'll talk about that. And then that whole thing about how do we evaluate shared technology when, unless you are actually delivered hardware, software, peripherals, operating system from your workplace, there's a good chance that people are using lots of different tools. One of the first things I do when I'm working with a training partner, for example, I want to know their hardware, their software, their platforms, operating systems, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, um, what their plans are in the future, and for them to know my limitations because we're in the Mac world here. And I would say 2 to 3% of the time we aren't able to work together, and then we find out another way to communicate. So that's a little bit what we're going to be talking about today. 3 big outcomes. Just let's be real practical. Improve your productivity. That's one big outcome for me. Second is, how do we coordinate communication? And by everybody taking a piece of what needs to be done, we lower the management costs for everyone. It's sort of a distributed idea. If everyone, for example, is proactive and doesn't wait for someone else to chase them, and we'll be talking about that in a couple of minutes, it makes it easier for everyone. Part of my, you might say, ethos in working online is I want to contact a working partner before they need to contact me. In other words, if there's a problem coming up, or if I haven't heard from them in a certain amount of time, I'll take the initiative to check in with them. I'll be the one. So most of the time they can trust me. Most of the time it's like, no, Pat's on top of it. I have a great client, not too far from you folks, up in Missouri and outside of Kansas City. Terrific person. I've worked with this person maybe 15 years across 4 different jobs that he's had. And we're going to be doing 2 programs this month. And I had put together a bunch of information. It was funny. It was almost like when I was hitting the send button to him, he was hitting the send button to me. And I gave him an outline of everything doing. And he said, this is great. You anticipated every question I had. Now, doesn't that build a better working relationship? And doesn't that make him more, and I'll use the word again, predisposed to take my phone calls, respond to my emails, right? Because I have lowered the burden of doing work for me. And then that positive workplace relationships, even at a distance. So I have to say, I have great clients. So most of the time when I see certain people's name pop up in a text or an email or a phone call or whatever, it's like, oh, good, it's so-and-so. You know, oh, cool, it's so and so. You know what? I want to be that person for other people. I want to be the person, if they see my name, it's like, oh, good, right? And so, with that team of people we had for this project out of Chicago, we all spent a teeny little bit of time, not a huge amount of time. It's like, how's it going? So, one of the folks who were the technical people is engaged. So we talked a little bit about what it's like to be the groom and wedding planning. And Tom and I turned out we had a lot of things in common, and we would check in with each other about stuff. And I'm a native Chicagoan, so we could talk about that. Had a lot of fun with the person in California, and kept in touch with our buddy who was the one who was connecting things. Because at the end of the day, we are an emotional species, not just a logical species. Okay, so those connections can make a big difference. Okay, first of all, what's that thing we call communication or management overhead? It's about everything we do in life, but what does it mean when you're online? So one of the first rules is that in this idea of transparency, that everything requires documentation and communication. And we're right now involved with some estate planning with 3 different lawyers in 3 different cities for a family member. And one of the things that my husband and I have to remind these 3 lawyers is to share email and share information. And there ain't no secrets. There ain't no secrets. One of the problems that we had with Tom at the beginning of our project, not a bad person, he was kind of making decisions on the fly, which is fine. He was the boss of the project. However, what it ended up is that he'd be thinking out loud, email me one thing, or what we were using Slack. Okay, he would private email me or text me on Slack to do A, but then he changed his mind, not tell me, but tell one of the other people and send them a different private message. And then he would come back to me, and after I'd worked 3 days on something to meet his deadline, and say, oh, did you get that note that I changed my mind? No, because he sent it privately rather than to the group. After that happened a couple of times, and I started becoming annoyingly proactive of basically contacting him 5 or 6 times a day to verify everything, he got the message. He got the message, and fortunately, one of the tech people had a very serious one-on-one talk. So we learned how important that was. There should not be any um, private conversations. And the thing that's of concern to me is it's so easy to triangulate, just like we do in an office where we grab someone to go into the break room and say bad things about somebody else behind their back. We do this on email. So we have all these private conversations about what's wrong with this person and what's wrong with that person. And guess what happens? Someday, inevitably, we click the wrong button, and the person we've been talking about privately gets to see everything we've said about them in the last month. It's happened to me, and I've seen it happen to other people. So the transparency is a main part of that, being able to document things and communicate things to everyone. And if you have people on a project who are part-timers, this isn't their full-time job. They may have 3 or 4 other jobs, or in our case, long-distance workers. Yes, it costs more to manage them. It costs more to manage them if we're all in the same office. It costs more to manage them if we're at a distance. You know, and when someone says, well, what do you mean cost, Pat? What I will do is I'll say, what are the communication breakdowns that you're having? And how many of them have been there, and what other things do they have to pay attention to? You know, people like Tom are probably juggling 30 or 40 national and international webinars and online courses at any given minute. You know, knowing that makes me know that in effect, even though he's a full-time employee of the association, I only have a little piece of his attention, and I better be careful about how I communicate with him. Now, again, this is obvious, but it has to do with personal culture, how we think about the world, what we say, the vocabulary we use, assumptions we make about other people. And I don't care if it's your best friend who's lived next door to you your whole life or a family member. Isn't it interesting how individually culture comes in, because people always are talking to me about culture when we're dealing with people in other countries or other part of the countries. And I said, well, let's start with the fact that you haven't talked to your Aunt Agnes for 20 years. That's a cultural issue often as well. So we need to be kind with each other, and able to talk to each other about these issues. So one caveat is the English language is extremely slippery because we have so many synonyms for the same thing. And even for those of us who grew up speaking English or, a couple of other languages, we can say something like, I want you to do a good job on this. Well, what the heck does good job mean? One thing that I was able to impart on the team that I worked with is they'd say, okay, Pat, give us some copy. Don't you love that? Just give us some copy. And I'd say, okay, what I need to do a good job for you is I am old school. I'm from, grew up in the print media world before there was electricity. I need to know how many words you need. I need to know what the tone is, and I need to know by when you need it in what format. And Tom and our tech team seemed a little surprised that I wanted it that definite. But you know what? After a month or two of me politely nagging and saying, I really do need, before I go on, how many words, because that really tells me what I should write and how I write it. And can I send a sample first to see if I'm on the right track? You know what? I noticed after a few months, it became a habit for everyone. So suddenly, without thinking, Tom would say, okay, Pat, I need these many words by this, and this is the format I need. And don't you think everything went smoother for everyone when they were able to tell me that? So first of all, who is the boss? And our family, our pet people, and yes, our cats ran our office for many years. So who makes the decision for the entire WorkNet and how? Because out of sight, out of mind means people become autonomous, right? Autonomy, self-rule. So they feel like, well, I'm here. I can't check in with my boss 100 times a day, which is true. So how are decisions made in this group? These are just some of the things that we have to think about when we're coordinating a project at a distance with other people. A couple of them kind of stick out for me. One of them is the idea of work orders. A work order sounds fancy and cumbersome, but it's really just the old project management: who, what, when, where, why, how. And it might be like my asking Tom and the crew, tell me how many words and what's the topic, what's the purpose, whatever, and when do you need it by? In contract law, if you don't have a deadline, there's no contract. That was something taught to me by a client who was also a lawyer who taught contract law. And that changed the way I dealt with people in a workplace. Not when you get around to it, not, well, when it's easy for you to do it. Oh, in a timely fashion. I want 3 o'clock on Friday. I want 3 o'clock on Friday. Another thing which I think is important is procedures. And there's a balancing act when you have a team working at a distance between how much autonomy everyone has to accomplish the work, the how they do it, and when there actually has to be step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, for various reasons. It may be, for example, that you're working in the medical community and everything is obedient to the HIPAA rules, and so you have to do things to ensure privacy. In some of the things, for example, in working with this group of lawyers, one of the ideas that came up, which I didn't know, and I've done this work before, did not know that in the faxes I was sending to the lawyer about some bills that needed to be paid, I had to put in every fax, yes, this particular invoice has been approved by my husband, who is the executor for the estate. And now I'm adding that to all the fax things. I just found that out 2 days ago because we couldn't figure out why a couple of bills weren't being paid in a timely fashion. Now we know. So when we can't make assumptions that even if people are experienced at their work, that they're going to know every single part of their work. Let me pause a second here. And I haven't been monitoring the questions, but kind of focusing on the presentation. But I want to see, have any questions come in from our audience today that this would be a good time for me to respond to? Oh, here we go. Okay. Anything? I don't hear anything, so I'm going to keep going. Thank you. We'll check in again in a few minutes. Okay. So when you talk about this Worknet, and please excuse me, I just love this word. There's some things that need to be in place that might already be in place if you had this when you were working together, about things like the shared mission and vision, the priorities of the institution, you know, when you're looking at what we should be working on, what we should be spending the most attention to, what are our resources going to. It works really well. For example, I just had a conversation yesterday with one of my library clients, and she was in charge of the programming that occurred at this large library, suburban library with, I think, 14 branches. And we were talking about what was succeeding, and she said, we're really committed to customer service here. And it's really wonderful that our first priority was to move as much of the program as we could online. And because of that, we were ready, set, go, and we have produced a wonderful content and programming that our clients like and they think is great. So that was really terrific. The organizational culture. How did we get things done before we had to be online or had the current technology? Do we have a history of being able to work together well, and how were decisions made? What were the customer priorities? Now, in our little business, we have to compete with big training organizations from not just the United States, all over the world. And one of the ways we've made a good reputation is responsive customer service. So if there was a tornado heading for our house, we would still try to pick up the phone, answer the phone, and do customer service. And we had a man who worked for us for several years, wicked smart, nice guy. And this was a few years ago when we were just getting into heavy duty webinar production. And we had clients all over who had never taken a webinar before, didn't know how to do things. It was, I think, about 8 years ago. And so there were a lot of questions coming in and problems. And the person, and I'll say that his name was Brad, who was very good. I would say your job, Brad, number one, first thing, respond to customer problems. We'll be getting emails, texts, and phone calls and faxes from people. Your job is to do that. Well, look, those calls weren't coming in like every second. Okay, so he had some time to do other things, but there was a fatal day when I walked into his office because somebody had emailed me 30 minutes before with a problem. And I delegated to Brad. That was his job. And I noticed that it had not been answered, and I just walked into his office and said, "What's up?" And he said something very bad. He said, "I haven't gotten around to it." And I said, "Drop everything you're doing and email the client immediately and solve the problem." And he rolled his eyes at me. Don't roll eyes at the person who signs your paycheck. And I shrugged, and that's okay. And so I went back to my office, another 30 minutes. No sign that anything had been done. So I came back in his office and he said, "Well, I told you I couldn't get around to it." And I looked over his shoulder and I realized he was working on something that was fun for him, but not vital. And I said, "Now you get to call them, apologize, and fix it right away. That's your job. Number one." Um, I don't know what happened to him, to Brad rather, but Brad didn't last with us very long after that. And then we have the thing of the vendor constraints. And vendor constraints are what are the limitations of the technology we're using? What are the relationships we have with our support people out there? Are things being delivered on time and so on? So there's this whole structure that we have to check. And I tell people, that having to go online when you're used to being face-to-face is kind of a crucible for an organization. And when I say a crucible, I mean like that old-time pharmacological grind up stuff in a little stone bowl, because what you do is you intensify every single management and communication problem that the institution has, because you're now far away. You're now far away from each other. So it's sort of like it shakes the load-bearing walls to understand that, you know what, we thought we had a shared mission and vision. We thought we all understood the priorities. We thought we were getting along pretty well. Now we have to say maybe it wasn't as good as we thought it was going to be. Governance, the definition of governance, and that includes government or anything else, is who makes decisions, what decisions do they get to make, and how do they make the decisions. So when we took that extra time to deal with these things, while we were well into the project, it was very clear that we made Tom, and he said yes, he's like the Uber person who was in charge of making sure that everything was done right, that our tech guys in California and Florida would have to make technical decisions because sometimes we would ask them to do things that weren't possible on the platform we were using. And I have to say that everyone deferred to me in terms of content. So we worked together really well. And then we had these Uber groups, right? We have Uber meaning over. We had these overlords from the different professional committees in the association who would oversee what we did. And if they said jump, we would say how high. But Tom's job, which he understood very well, was to protect us from capricious decisions from the people on the committee. He said, if they ask us to do something that's not seemly, he said, I'll take the heat. And so we all work together pretty well. Once a decision is made, how is it communicated and documented? So there's no things that happen like me working on a project for 3 days that was canceled. Are actions taken in a timely fashion? And sometimes it takes a little give and take to get a notion of how long it's actually going to take to do something, particularly if it's something you were used to doing in an office with other people around and would get that instant communication and support, and now you're at home and the other person's 100 miles away, and maybe they're out watering the garden in the back, or they have a kid they're taking care of or something, and you're not being able to sort of walk across the hall to get that opinion. And are we evaluating in some way the decisions and actions that we're taking? Are we putting a pause button on, which usually means a more formal kind of weekly meeting to say, how did it go this week? Are we on track? Does anyone need any help? Is there a glitch of some kind? And to be honest with ourselves and with other people about those kinds of problems and what might be happening. Some of the protocols that we have to sort of get on the same page on is, and for me, the most important is what happens when you profoundly disagree and the work stops and it sort of gets stuck in arguing, should the door be red or blue? And it goes on for not minutes, but hours and even days, because there's no one to step in and say, okay, I get to make the decision, go back to work. What happens, and defaults are very important, what happens if you can't reach the other person and you're on a tight deadline? We're working on that with the 3 law firms, in effect, that we're dealing with, plus the folks on the properties that my husband is now helping to manage, where I said to him, let's put in place the defaults of, if we can't reach Phil in a timely fashion and a decision has to be made, and my husband makes the decision, what happens next? One of the things with technology that I'm a little obsessed with is backups. I will say this now, and I'll say this forever. The cloud is just somebody else's computer, right? It's somebody else's server. I've had Dropbox fail. I've had Google Docs fail. I've had everything fail, right? And so when people say, oh, just sort of scatter it into this thing called the cloud, people have this mystical attitude. I've had people blink in surprise when I say the cloud is just somebody else's computer. They go, oh, I never thought about that. Somewhere there's hardware and software and something plugged into a wall. So how do we all deal with backups? I had one big book project I worked on a few years ago where I was telling the people that we were working with for the first time that we were doing, because it was a big 380-page book with footnotes and a lot of detail, we were doing backups hourly, consistently, and then we were doing major backups once a day. So that and we were doing triple backups actually, because we've had 2 out of 3 backups fail. And the person in question went, well, we back our stuff up about once a month. And I sort of clutched my heart and said, no, we're going to have a different protocol. How, if you have a key player and they have a special issue, how do we accommodate them? Are there things that we have to customize for them? And then again, how often do you touch base? What's the urgency of the projects you're working on? How many changes? In effect, think of them as change orders that are going on that we have to negotiate and figure out. And yes, our slogan here at our little office is all technology sucks. Now understand, my husband and I are both geeks and nerds. My husband started programming in 1963. I've had either a dumb terminal or a computer on my desk since 1978. So we love technology, and my husband makes sure that I have the latest and the best and the greatest on my desk. Nonetheless, all technology fails. And if you haven't noticed, the pressure on the folks who provide platforms for us, who we're not expecting a zillion people to show up one day, all of the platforms we're using, even the ones that are pretty reliable, are a little wobbly right now. So we have to prepare for plan A, plan B, plan C, because technology will fail. What about this idea of rapport and goodwill? How to establish that feeling that we can work together, and what's that about? Um, Human beings connect in all sorts of ways. You know, it's the thing about commonalities. And one of the things that I like to do when I meet a person for the first time, they may be sitting next to me on an airplane. Remember the days we'd get on airplanes and there'd be people sitting next to us? It may be new people at work, new people on a team, on a committee, somebody moves in next door. One of the things I like to find out very quickly is what are those points of commonality, those shared experiences we might have had. Of course, work in itself is a shared experience that goes a long way to helping us communicate with each other better. To remind ourselves frequently about the shared goals and purposes. Why are we all here today? Why are we all here today? My dad ran a laboratory in a teaching hospital in Wisconsin. And one of the things he had to remind people on his team sometime, particularly if people were getting, let's say, a little petty, as humans can, he'd say, we're here to save lives. We're here for the emotional and physical well-being of the patient and their families, and their families. So if we make that number one, how does everything else go? If we're here for the customers, if we are here for whatever good we're doing in the world, and every kind of organization, what does that say? What are the shared culture and language and beliefs about things? I had a recent webinar that I was talking about some of my family's experiences in Eastern Europe, and got a wonderful email after the program was over from a lady who had been born and raised 2 countries over from where my family came from. And we exchanged a bunch of delightful things. And she said, well, I want to see how we can work together in the future. I'm going to go back and talk to my boss here and see if there's some way you can hire. You know, sometimes you get hired not because of anything rational, but because someone just liked somebody else. So we have hobbies that we have, pop culture, things we're doing to volunteer. I love now to check in with clients about what's the news, and particularly tell me the good news that's coming from your part of the country as well. And I tell people practice safe sharing. Uh, we misunderstand, we disagree, we speak abruptly without thinking. We don't realize that something that's innocent for us is not, might be even painful for the other person. So um, one of the rules when we're talking online is be quick to apologize and be quick to forgive. How's that? Be quick to apologize, be quick to forgive, and move on. Move on. And yes, if you have chronic behavior problems online, just like any place else, they need to be resolved in a timely fashion. I don't like bullies who use emotional intimidation of any kind under any circumstances. And nonetheless, there will be times that you'll make a mistake and the other person makes a mistake, and we have to decide how to deal with it so that people don't become afraid of each other. I don't want that to happen either. That's kind of at the other end of the spectrum as well. Before we go into this, I wanted to check again, and I'm going to play up here and see if we have, whoops, if we had any comments or questions that folks would like me to deal with right now. If I'm not hearing live from a host, if there's a way that I can connect with the questions, that would be great. Thank you. I'm checking right now. Okay. No new questions yet. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, one interesting thing that becomes kind of a myth is that we will use the word convenient. What is the best way to do things? I hardly ever use the word best. Okay. Hot fudge Haagen-Dazs coffee sundae with ground nuts is probably the best ice cream sundae. I'll give you that. And being a longtime baseball fan from Chicago, of course, putting her hand over her heart, we all love the Chicago Cubs, don't we? But a lot of things that we do on a day-to-day isn't actually the best way to do it. It's just that we're used to doing it that way. And one of the things I had to keep telling myself over and over again on the project that I mentioned before, having to use 3 different kinds of technology to get things done, um, was the fact that I wasn't used to it. I have mastered harder stuff than this, okay? I mastered a manual drive on a car. I can do anything. So even though I am used to certain hardware and software and ways of doing things, now my attitude is, it's just that I'm used to the other ones. Let me get familiar with this, and eventually it's going to become maybe not easy peasy, but easier to deal with. And I think that's sort of an attitude that we have to have ourselves and model that for other people on our team as well. Um, Goodwill and Manners. Okay, don't make them chase you down. I mentioned that before. My husband has a very simple but incredibly effective system for keeping in touch with people. And it's literally just a text file. Nothing fancy to it. It's not a database, just a searchable text file. And he keeps track for his key customers when it was the last time he talked to them. Also, for all the peripheral people he has to deal with projects, he's basically an economist who works with the inventor CEOs of kind of leading technology companies. So he's dealing with wicked smart people. But every time he has a conversation, and mostly he does a lot of stuff online, but he mostly also talks on the phone with people and does some group stuff. He keeps track, so he can see who haven't I talked to in a month, who haven't I talked to in 2 months or 3 months. I have a similar system. I have a database system, but I have a similar system on my computer for the way that my brain works. And so I'm like, oh, I haven't heard from them in a while. If I'm working on active projects with people, usually they can count on hearing from me at least once every 2 weeks, but usually once a week, at least, like, how's it going? How's it going? And it doesn't have to be a Skype, Zoom, or video phone call. Okay, guys? Use guys out there. It can simply be a phone call or a text message. It doesn't have to be as elaborate as we're making it. That's where part of our exhaustion is coming from, is how much time and energy it takes our brains and our bodies to be able to deal with 40 different windows on a Zoom thing. So I would say Zoom and other platforms are fine, but I don't want you to wait until you have a window to set up a Zoom conference with another person before you can do something. If you have to have that one-on-one phone call, why don't you have a one-on-one phone call? There's a lot of stuff that the nuances don't work very well in text. And we keep focusing on what's the customer's needs as well. But here's the trick. My definition of a customer is anyone you have a transaction with or an interaction with in the workplace of any kind. And with that definition, everybody you deal with is a customer as well. Now, audio etiquette, isn't that an interesting idea? We have, like everyone else, smartphones and cell phones and so on. But you know what? In our little house, in our little business, we actually have 3 landlines. And those landlines are much more stable than cell phone and smartphone broadcasts. And so there have been times where everything else is broken down, but we still had those landlines. Now, I'm hard of hearing. Too many years, the doctors say, on airplanes. So if you are talking to people, talk a little slower, not make it so exaggerated that the other person is going to be driven crazy. But I would say that 75% of the people I talk to on a phone talk too fast. And if you're talking to someone who has hearing loss like I do, and above the age of 50, it's estimated by some folks that something like 50% of men, it's something having to do with gender that I don't understand, are more likely to have ear loss or hearing loss than women. And by the time you get people up in their 60s and 70s like me, guess what? A lot of people have hearing loss. You don't have to talk louder. You just have to speak slowly and clearly and enunciate. If it's phone numbers and addresses, you repeat them and or send them by mail. And the 24-hour rule is that if you assign somebody to do something or somebody else is assigned to do it, you just send a little ping like, how's it going, within 24 hours? Because we're moving faster online than we are if we have people around us, and we want to make sure things don't fall between the cracks. And finally, don't be too cute. Don't be too cute in what you say back and forth. Make sure that you being cute and sly and sarcastic doesn't interfere with the actual message that you're trying to send someone else. I see a lot of more people doing this. So praise, praise, praise. Right now I'm working on a project with 2 people who teach project management. First thing I noticed that Wilma sent me an email yesterday, and she actually followed all of these rules. She summarized in the subject line of the email exactly what the topic was. She didn't bury the lead. I knew in the headline what we were going to be talking about. There were 4 points she wanted to say. She listed them in the first screen that would pop up, and she numbered them. So I knew that there was 1, 2, 3, and 4. She doesn't send big, huge emails. I'm guilty of that. Sometimes I send emails that are too long, but usually I try only to send to people who like to read long emails. But if it has to be that big an email, then it should be an attachment of some kind. And I always check as a courtesy what can their computer handle. So sometimes I'm sending people videos that are 100 megabytes. And I find out which platform do they prefer to use for the transfer. Will they take a zip file? Do they prefer Dropbox or some other format? What can we do? Or maybe their institution has something, and we'll test it, right? And we avoid emotion. When emotion comes into it and you're not just dealing with facts, you better pick up the phone or even have a phone conference, because so much is communicated in the sound of someone's voice as much as the look on their face. I don't think Zoom is accurate. You can see I have a little bias here. Uh, it does send you a lot of information. We just want to make sure it sends the right information as well. Pros and cons of using social media. I think it's the confidentiality versus the loss of legacy, meaning that you got to be careful if you're communicating with people in such a way that there's too many private conversations going on and people aren't learning what they need to do well. Again, backups, the cloud. And one thing which I think is a real problem, and I've experienced this firsthand, is the issue of hardware and software updates. And the problem that I have, which I know a lot of you have too, you're working with critical software, your hardware does an operating system update, and guess what? The stuff you've been relying on for years stops working sometime forever. So we don't upgrade fast here. In fact, I probably upgrade too slow at times. But until I'm satisfied by reading user boards that that particular software I rely on is going to work in the next operating system, I don't sign up with it. And I watch my calendar so I can communicate with my husband, who does a lot of this for me. Yeah, marry a systems analyst or partner with a systems analyst. That's some romantic advice. I will tell him, okay, I have a space right now. I have a week. And he said, oh, it'll only take a couple of hours. And they say, yeah, you know, on the planet Vulcan, but this is Earth. And then he'll set it up and everything is fine. And then we'll have problems and then we'll call and everything will be fine. But you don't do it like 5 minutes before you have something important. And if we trust each other, if we talk to each other, if we meet our deadlines, if we operate transparently, more and more people will likely be willing to follow those very few rules that you've put in place to make things work well. So what do we expect on the team? When we think about these other people, what do they expect of us? What do we have to be careful about? That negotiation is very important. Technology eccentricities. I worked on a big project out of the University of North Texas for 7 years, and one of the other people who worked with me had everything in open source on her machine, and one of the results is she could not accept, read, or make PDFs. We had to fix that because we couldn't work anymore. And she grumbled. She had this, you know, hatred of PDFs. I'm not sure why. And we came up with a good solution, but that was sort of amusing. If we have to offer people choices, we can't accommodate 15 different eccentric technologies. 3, I think, is good. Well, here's the 3 choices. When I first talk to someone, I capture all their contact information, their name, their address, their physical address, their phone number, the other 17 phones they have, where their partner or spouse works. I mean, anything I can get, because it's no fun trying to chase somebody down on a deadline and they left the office early and forgot to tell anybody. What if they left their digital office early? They forgot to tell you that they were going to take a timeout and turn off all the technology in their house. What do you do? I just had a client who couldn't get onto a conference I was on 2 days ago because, as they put it, they were in Dallas, I'm in Denver. They said, Pat, there was a tornado in between you and me, and none of my technology worked for 3 hours. Well, you know, if I had known that in advance what her contact information was, we could have done something else. She was a client, she was new, we didn't have that information. And again, those one-on-one phone calls I think is really important. And we have to remember that things change, like the wonderful lady in charge of the project, not only, by the way, became president of her association, but announced her retirement in the middle of everything and retired 4 months before the project was done. I just had another project I was on. I loved it. Great partner in Texas. Everything was fine. A week before we were supposed to go live, I contact her and she said, oh, didn't we tell you? I quit 2 weeks ago. Didn't the company tell you? So I'm out of the loop. Well, she was the only contact I had at the company beside the head of it, who I had a good relationship with. But it was like, it would have been nice if someone had remembered to tell me after 2 weeks that you weren't here. I thought that I didn't say out loud. All these different things can change and make a big difference in how people communicate with each other. So we have to be able and willing to evaluate how the technology works, and please never say everything is fine, because the pantheon of the of the technology gods and goddesses will rain down on your heads because they have a sense of humor. Is technology sentient? You betcha. Do they know what a deadline is? You betcha they know. So we test everything beforehand, even if we've tested it 50 times before, if it's important. One of my clients told me, and she produces national webinars. Her company produces about 12 or 15 a month, that she was working with somebody she had worked with before as a presenter, and she told the presenter, you need to come on an hour before. And the presenter said, oh, we've tested this, everything's fine, everything's fine. Well, one thing in the world you have to be aware of is these folks the platforms will do upgrades and changes and not tell their end customers. Sure enough, they got online 60 minutes before the program was supposed to start. It took 45 minutes for the presenter to get her part working because one key feature she needed for her configuration no longer existed. It had existed the week before. We need to check the bug reports and also ask for software updates. Some people hardly ever update their software or only do it because of third party. So you might say, what version are you working on right now? On that software? Do you have something on your machine that's alerting you to software? Maybe a good thing to do is to do the updates and then let's check it again. And what are your backups? And what do you do if the backups fail? So I like to spend a little time negotiating on all those ugly, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And one of the caveats I have, of course, is that if you have something critical that requires that people at different sites have to be on for a conference or a presentation of some kind, you want to rehearse, and the rule of thumb is you rehearse with people at their sites and at your sites, and everybody is actually using the actual hardware and software and peripherals and the location that they would be doing the actual program. So right now I'm in my office and this is where I do my presentations. And yes, I probably do tech checks with different training partners 2 or 3 times a week. Monday, I have a tech check with a client that I've been working with for 5 years. Not coincidentally, she runs technology classes. And so when we were first working together, we agreed, oh yes. And then we swapped a bunch of amusing horror stories, right? But no puppies die. So we have to take that into consideration as well. So we have to, in this day and age, evaluate the technology of people on a team at least once a month to look at upgrades, hardware, software, peripherals, operating systems, to make sure there's not someone lagging behind, or are we all deciding we ain't going to go to the new upgrade for 6 months and let somebody else work out the bugs? So in effect, we're all on the same page. And through experience, you have to watch out for smart cookies because smart cookies think they're immune to mistakes. Someone has to be in charge. And we now come to one of the interesting anomalies in technology. So the contradiction, number one, is that one person should oversee and coordinate technology. So when I'm working on a project like this, there's one person on the team who sort of says what kind of technology you're working on. Do you have the upgrade? Is this software working? Do you have what you need? Do you need a private coaching session or something like that? And can sometimes make decisions for people as well. On the other hand, no one person should be the know-it-all and nobody else has access to that information. It's kind of like in a family where one person in the family is the car whiz, and they're the ones who takes the car in to get it repaired, and they're the ones who take care of oil changes and all that good stuff. That's fine. But what about everybody else in the family? Does everyone know how to check the oil? Does everyone know how to jumpstart the car? Does everyone else know how to change a tire? Or does everyone else know how to diagnose problems on it? So even though you need one person to govern, you don't want everyone else to be, quote, ignorant about what needs to be done. Reliable compatibility is a myth. Another client I'm working with here in Colorado has a big national project they're working on with a group in Georgia. And I've been very firm and they've been good about it. I said, I'm not taking one more step until I have an actual live tech check with the tech people at that institution, because they keep saying everything's fine. And I don't believe that until we actually have boots on the ground figuring out if this stuff is going to work. We also encourage people to keep the versions they use simple as possible. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of backups again, over and over and over. So what are the next steps that we need to take? I would say that if this is a little overwhelming with you, what's one thing that you can do to improve communication and to make sure everybody is on the same page? Now, I'm going to check in now, and I'm going to see if we have anybody here. We have a new message down here. Very good. Yes, very nice note. This is excellent information, right? Thank you. Thank you. I channel from the best. And relationship building and maintenance is critical. Thanks for presenting this information. You're very welcome. So we'll check and see if we have any other questions or comments. Otherwise, I'll turn things back over to Bree and Kana. And thank you very much for joining us today.